So good morning, everyone. And on behalf of the Professional Insurance Agents of New Jersey, we thank you for your attendance and support. My name is Christopher Powell, and I serve as the chairman of the Business Issues and Communications Committee for PIANJ, and we'll be moderating today's deep dive. The PIANJ Deep Dive Series is a discussion of trending topics occurring in our industry that is designed to help educate, inform, and guide our members and their clients accordingly. For your convenience, we have added a link for a glossary of terms that you may hear during our discussion, so please feel free to click on that, and they may help you accordingly. Joining us this morning is Keith Savino. Keith is a managing partner of Warwick Resources Group, Broadfield Insurance. He is the national cyber practice leader for PCF Insurance. He works on the executive lines of the business with focus on professional, E&O, EPLI, D&O, and of course, what we're here for today, which is technology and cyber exposures. We also have with us Sean Hoar with Constangy Cyber Team. His background includes almost 25 years of experience with data privacy and information security matters, and is a former cyber attorney for the United States Department of Justice. With that said, questions and comments are encouraged. You can please submit them through the chat, and we will get them included as we go through this. With that said, let's get started. So, gentlemen, welcome. Thank you for your attendance, and thank you for joining us this morning. Obviously, today we're here to discuss cyber and really the anatomy of a cyber claim. What happens? When does it happen? How does it happen? What are we here to talk about? Cyber. So, how should we talk about it? How should we get our clients engaged? Where do we start? Keith, would you like to take that question?
Sure, Chris. I'll start it off first. First of all, the cyber market itself is substantial. It's expected to grow from about $12 billion worth of annual premiums to $60 billion in the next 5 or so years, according to Lloyd's. And it's one of those lines of business that needs to go from, does the client need cyber, to what are the questions that I could ask to qualify this? And, my attitude is that at some point in time, cyber, like many other, mandatory insurance coverages like workers' comp or commercial auto, business auto, and personal auto, will start to find their way into the regulators' hearts, minds, and making sure that the consumers are protected. But until that occurs, and if that never occurs, I focus on who needs cyber. And there's 3 questions that I think that everybody needs to ask. And if a client can answer yes to any of these 3 questions, even one of them, then they clearly need coverage to protect their client's best interests. Here's the first one. Does the insured have any customers? That's the first one. The second one is, do they have a bank account? Now, it's even tougher if they have money in the bank, but if they have a bank account, absolutely. And do they keep any information about their customers, employees, or personal information on a device, in a folder, in a box in their trunk, in a storage facility they have a nice key to, wherever it might be? So I guess effectively the point that I'm making here, if you haven't figured out the sarcasm, is there's literally no reason that you can come up with that tells me that if you have a client that has customers, a bank account, or any information, that they shouldn't carry cyber. Now, I could go on to talk about operational threats as well. So I'm going to add a bonus 4th question that I haven't mentioned until today, which is, does the client have any suppliers, vendors, or operational technologies that empower their business, that if that 3rd party was to suffer a breach, which caused them to not be able to run their business, would that harm them? So this is much further than just a credit card transaction or doing online transactions, which of course is the way people thought about cyber 25 years ago.
And they're very, very good questions, and I appreciate that, Keith. So I'm going to ask Sean to join in as well. But before I do, I think that's really the crux of what happens when an agent does meet with their clients. Well, I always hear, it's in the cloud, I'm protected. Or, well, what could possibly happen to my client? This is all they do. They don't do this or they don't do that. So they're very important questions to ask. But I mean, why are these questions so important from an agent's perspective when sitting with a client? Keith, Sean?
Well, to Keith's point, I think 6 or 7 years ago, the focus was, if I don't have consumer data, then I shouldn't be concerned. But if I do have consumer data, well, then maybe I'll consider it. and maybe if it's payment card data, maybe it's a higher priority than something else. The reality is everybody's got data now. And even if you're a business to business entity and you don't have a lot of consumer data, the reality is if your operation system is shut down or encrypted, you can't do business. And that's the key. That's part of what I think Keith was trying to intimate. If you've got a computer, if any of your system is based on digital data, you've got to have some backup. You've got to protect yourself economically because there'll be a residual effect. You can only do so much technologically. And we see so many instances where the folks in the manufacturing sector, for instance, it could be a small, it could be a very large business, but in the manufacturing sector, they may have no consumer information in the systems, but their operating systems get shut down, and we see it on a weekly basis. We're having large manufacturing instances, their revenue cycle is shut down. And or they've got employees they haven't thought about, but their employees' SSNs are taken out the back door and sold on the dark web. So whatever type of business you do, regardless how big or small, unfortunately, your target, your data is at risk.
So let's focus, if we may, quickly on personal identifiable information, because I think that's where agents will have a difficult conversation with clients sometimes, because the client says, I store no data, or I store no one's information. Even my employees, for that matter, so you're telling me we have, paper files. It's in the computer system somewhere, somehow. So can we just maybe touch upon what's considered personal identifiable information, or what would help our agents or others that are on the call to explain you have data, and whether it's protected data or not, you have it.
Sure. Keith, what I'll do is I'll briefly talk about data breach notification statutes. Perhaps we'll go there. So all 50 states have a data breach notification statute that requires businesses who may have had unauthorized access to personal information to immediately notify those consumers that their information has been accessed without authorization. All states require notification if, in fact, you've got an SSN, a social security number affected, a driver's license affected, or a financial account with the means to access the account affected. However, almost the majority of states have expanded those definitions to also include health insurance information, medical information, it could be biometric information, and some other personal identifiers that might subject somebody to identity theft or financial fraud, like passport information. But the bottom line is that definition of personal information, the trend is expanding across the country. And so those businesses who possibly deal with consumer information, and it could be their employee information as well. If you've got employees and you've got human resources information that could be affected, you've got to be prepared. Now, the reality is those statutes place the onus of that notification on the owner of that data. So say you're an employer, but you use a third party to store that data. And like to Keith's point, if that third party gets hit with something and their data is leaked, well, it's your data. It's your responsibility to actually notify, unless contractually you've somehow shifted that liability. And so regardless of whether the data is in your system, if it's a third party, unless contractually you've shifted that obligation to notify, that comes right back to you every single time, and you still have to be prepared.
And by the way, I'm going to give a little shout out to Sean, who's literally written the book on this. This is what everyone doesn't know, that is on a state-by-state basis that he touched on in just a few moments. And one of the pieces related to folks saying to you, oh, I don't know that I have a lot of PII. I don't know that I have a lot of this data. It's a very small portion of what you're looking to insure against. So that would be like saying, oh, I don't have a lot of property in my office, so I'm just not going to carry a business personal property policy, right? The fact is, in the cyber world, you have both tangible and intangible exposures, and we're solving for those intangible exposures that you're just not going to find coverage for in other lines of business. There's a very good reason for it. I'll continue with the sarcasm I started earlier. I have offered to clients we have a lot of retail partners around the country that I work with, that if they have a client who really believes they don't need this coverage, I'll tell you what, if I can't show them that they can, I will buy them lunch. In the past 5.5 years, I've never bought anybody lunch. So the reality is there's operational technologies that can impact you. A pipeline went out. I've had agriculture accounts who said, what do you mean? Only to find out that, guess what? All the systems that they use to put down water and fertilizer are automated. Guess what happens if those automation systems get impacted? A little too much water or a little too much fertilizer can have a major impact on our food. There's 16 areas of critical infrastructure in the United States. Every agent should be aware of what those are. And those are areas that are not even in question as to what it should be. And then you mentioned PII, but I want to mention PHI. So you're going to have clients who might have medical concerns or they've captured information. And now just because they're not in healthcare doesn't mean that they didn't have a workers' comp claim that they processed and they have that information in their office. Insurance agents and brokers have lots of this information. So anything related to, some sort of injury that somebody had that they're maintaining or to someone's health information, your employees are out sick throughout the year. All of this information falls under many, many, many individual state regulations that you have an obligation to. And if that happens, you need a 1-800 oh my God number, right? You need to start somewhere, because if your insured does not have that access, guess who's getting the phone call first? Your office. And they're going to say, do I have coverage for this? That's going to be the question. And then you're going to have to explain why in the past 20 years you never offered it. That's not a place you want to be.
Well, and Keith, I might add that in terms of when I try to explain that to people in terms of the different types of costs you can incur, that starts out with the first party costs. And that could be your operational costs, it could be your hardware, your software that's corrupted. And because of the way cyber has developed, it may not be covered by other policies. It has to be covered by a data privacy or information security or network related policy. So you've got your first party cost. That's the cost you directly incur when you have an incident. It may also be that fraudulent wire transfer, the money that left the back door from some malicious actor and you didn't realize it, or some other type of fraud where you're losing money. It could also be third party costs, and those are perhaps most expensive. That's where maybe somebody finds out you've had an incident and they believe their data has been affected, and they sue you. It's a class action defense. That gets very expensive very quickly. And then you've got what I refer to as the remediation costs. Those could be your forensic remediation to your system. It could be the consumer remediation, the notification and credit monitoring, identity theft protection you're providing to consumers. A third bucket of costs. The better you remediate, the more you reduce your liability, the third party cost, but there could still be a cost there. But then you finally have another part that's very difficult to control, and that's your fines and penalties. That's that regulatory spectrum. And to your point, Keith, with regard to the book you referenced, we have to keep in mind that we're not talking about just 50 state data breach notification statutes. We're talking industry-specific statutes and regulations. Healthcare, the Office for Civil Rights of the Department of Health and Human Services, they actually enforce HIPAA. And to the extent that you're a covered entity or a business associate of a covered entity, you're going to have a notification obligation. And the reality is, under those state statutes, many of them have also incorporated similar definitions. And so even if you're not a HIPAA covered entity, you may still have notification obligations to a state because they've increased their personal information definition to include PHI or something very, very similar. But you've also, if you're a publicly held company, you've got the SEC now that's got a relatively new notification or disclosure rule. If you do anything work in the defense industry, you've also got some information you've got to disclose to DoD. And so you've got to really watch that business specific sector you're in. If you're a retail entity, obviously you've got PCI related data that you're going to have to disclose to card brands. And so you've got to be very prepared for where you are within the systems to identify who you're regulated by to make sure you don't breach any contract or expectation or regulation.
Yep.
So with that, Sean, earlier you mentioned about, quote unquote, owning the information, and if proper or not, because I've done some environmental work as well, and the proper disposal of, say, asbestos for that matter. I mean, if you own it from cradle to grave. So would that be a proper analogy in this case with regards to the information? You take it in, you own it. It's your obligation to protect and secure that information from start to end. Not that there's an end in this case, but again, a lot of people, I believe, have this theory that it's in the cloud, I'm protected, or I have a vendor who manages this and I'm protected, and that clearly is just not the case.
Well, true story, and the reality is sometimes people forget the fact that if you've got data in your systems, it was there 30 years ago or 20 years ago, and it hasn't been degaussed or deleted or somehow disposed, it's still in your system, and the bad guys get access to it. You still have a responsibility to notify somebody, regardless whether a current or a former employee or a current or former client. if it's still in your system, it still constitutes personal information. But in terms of the third-party instance, it's coming to be almost a majority of the incidents we handle are from third parties who affect clients. You talk about the cloud. Years ago, companies started to move to the cloud because ostensibly that's more secure. Well, a malicious actor knows that that's where the data is going, so that's where the malicious actors are going. Willie Horton, I guess, years ago said, why do you rob banks? And they said, well, because that's where the money is. Well, the bad guys go to the cloud because that's where the data is. That's what they can monetize. That's what they can steal, whether it's personal information or PHI, or proprietary information, or something else they can monetize. They're going where the data is, and the cloud is where that is.
Yep. I'll like Chris to connect this to what insurance agents were taught from the very first day that they went to take their license. It's care, custody, and control, right? So to your point, if you're trusting me with your information, if you drop off your dry cleaning and I lose your jacket, if I, take your car in for service and it gets, destroyed, if your property gets destroyed, that's fine. Well, we have the same expectation when we go to a doctor's office that they're going to treat my information with care, custody, and control, or basically any place that I do business. So as an owner of a business, you have a moral, an ethical, and a regulatory responsibility to protect that data. I think part of the challenge, my role here on this call is to speak about, distribution of it. The challenge that retail agents face is that many folks did not start with technology in the forefront, and technology makes people's eyes glaze over and roll into the back of their head, right? So when you speak about a commercial package policy, you think in terms of the BOP and the workers' comp and the business auto and the umbrella, and it's kind of stops there, and you've checked the boxes, and that is that's great in 1988. It's not great in 2023. And a lot of that has to do with what Sean just pointed out with the comfort level of first and third party claims. Most claims that folks suffer from a general liability standpoint are because someone walked into a retail store, tripped over the transom, and 2 years later they got a lawsuit, right? So a claim has to do with a demand for monetary damages. To Sean's point before, we could know internally that we have a claim before anyone makes a demand for monetary damages. So when we have knowledge of an act that's going to give rise to a claim, or we walk in and find the blue screen of death on our point of sale system, and even in a small business, we have the beginnings of a claim. It has already occurred. And the threat actors have gotten smarter and smarter to where you could say, well, geez, I've got good backups. Well, a lot of threat actors have been in your system for 6 or 7 months, and they've made sure to impact every single backup that you have. And these are very expensive claims, which we'll talk about in a moment. And I'll go back to the fact that just because you didn't learn how to sell cyber doesn't mean you shouldn't sell cyber. So the reality is that you need to be in front of your clients 100% of the time, checking this box. A yes is okay and a no is okay, but a maybe is out of the question.
So that's a good transition for us, and I can share a professional story wherein last week we were notified that a client did in fact have a breach and received a demand. Fortunately for us, and please, I'm not patting myself on the back, but I had discussed it with the client simply because of their exposures. And again, on the package part, they had about $50,000 built into the, as a throw-in with the carrier, not a separate monoline cyber policy that offers much more extensive coverage. And thankfully, I had them also check that box. They acknowledged, the limited coverage that they had, and sure enough, they remembered it. They knew it. But here we are, processing the claim for them, and now their renewal comes up in December. So we're going to obviously now absolutely go through and get separate cyber quotes. So it does happen, ladies and gentlemen, and it's happening more and more every day. Speaking of it happening, so Keith, where do we get started as an agent? You get the application from your carrier. What does the application look like? I am well aware of circumstances from carriers that will not even consider a risk unless the business has certain things already in place, such as multi-factor authentication, endpoint detection, things of that nature. So how do we get started in, filling out an application? What do we need to know? And, where do we go from there?
Yeah, I'm going to start with comfort zones. The very first is a little education goes a long way, right? Most folks in this business are, in fact, digital immigrants. Technology got thrown to them in the middle of their lifespan in the industry, And it's like moving to another country and having to learn a new language. So a
Right.
little bit of education goes a long way. Understand the difference between tangible and intangible exposures. Understand the first and third party aspects of the coverage. So, intentionally, this session was not designed to be a line by line policy analysis, because the last part of this piece, or part of it, is claims experience goes a long way to helping you understand what exposures your clients might have and how to solve them. So all of us in the industry who have gone through an automobile accident or a fire, once you've been through that experience, it helps you in describing those experiences to your insured or prospective client. Having not had that experience, it makes it really difficult to wrap your head around it. So the point of this session today and the anatomy of the claim is to speak about those claims experiences that actually help you do a better job for your client. And then understand your market segment. So the SMB space, or small market space, generally defined as 25 million in revenue and under in this space, sometimes up to $100 million in revenue, has just as heavy use of automation. You will find from an application process that those small market accounts are easier to submit. There's a heavy use of presumptive quoting in that space as well. And that most of the folks you're going to do business with can probably turn those indications around in 3 to 5 minutes in that space. There are, of course, some exceptions to certain classes of business, et cetera. On the mid-market side, you're going to find a more traditional submission process. You'll be taking some more time on the application process as well. And, related to the application, let's just remind everyone, all insurance is applied for, right? Despite commercials where it looks like someone takes a box of insurance off the shelf and they're ready to go. Insurance is applied for. And that's where I think there is often a gap of quoting everybody, because I think tech makes people nervous. I often say, MFA, ports and encryption. Oh my, this is the stuff that makes people crazy. But, and Sean, this came up in a session I saw you in recently, even the underwriters, and this is important, know to look past the application to the quality of the risk. The application is a starting point in mid-market, but you also have to be comfortable enough to get on the phone and have those conversations with underwriters and walk them through the quality of the risk. Further, we've always learned that claims were a really bad thing, right? Get the loss runs, et cetera, et cetera. Well, if a client has had a claim, you might find that there are underwriters who want to know details about that claim, and they may actually believe that because an insured has already had a claim scenario, they may have remediated that in such a way that they may be a better risk today than they were before they had that initial claim scenario. So think differently during the application process and recognize that the underwriters are very receptive to look at these risks. They want to have conversations about them. And this is not just any other application. Own it and complete it and work with it with the client in the completion.
Very, very good point. So Sean, from the perspective of threat actors, let's talk about, the criminal business model, if you will. Keith mentioned a moment ago as well, foreign states, obviously China is always brought to the forefront. Russia clearly is out there, but, Eastern Europe, Euro-Asia, where are the threat actors coming from and how are they operating?
Great question. And there's so many things I'd like to follow up with what Keith just said. If you don't mind me telling one quick story, and then I'll jump into it if you don't mind.
Please do.
Oftentimes we will have a client when we're in the middle of a crisis calling us, so I'm not sure I want to file a claim because my premiums will go up. And I'm reminded of when one of my sons got his driver's license. It couldn't have been more than a minute had elapsed when he had his first fender bender. And I thought, oh, great. The last thing I want to do is call my broker friend because my premiums will go up because I got the 16-year-old kid with a fender bender already. In the cyber world, it's completely different because, first of all, they want to be responsive. And I found that the vast majority of claims counsel actually come to the table knowing what your coverage is, wanted to make sure you understand what that coverage is so you can utilize the resources provided through your premiums, right? And then in terms of the claims process, typically it's very seamless. When you provide that information to the carrier, they have the information, the bills get paid, if you will. And there's, we see litigation, but it's really it's a fraction of a percent of those other cases that actually go rather seamlessly. And so with regard to cyber, like to Keith, exactly what Keith said, once you go through an incident, you have remediated those vulnerabilities. You are much better underwriting risks. And so to the extent your premiums go up, it's typically an industry increase versus a per client increase, because you're a much better underwriting risk regardless of who that application is presented to. But to your question, Chris, we find that our team, I manage a team of 60 professionals across the country, some of whom do proactive work, some do defensive litigation work, stuff that lawsuits that arise out of data breaches. But the core of our team, about 40 legal professionals, are handling data breach response every single day. And we handle a baseline of 45 plus new data breaches a week to manage for corporations. So that's just an indication that the malicious actors are very, very busy. And many of them are very professional, unfortunately. And so we see most of those who want to monetize data are those that come out of Eastern Europe, those that perhaps associate with Russia. They may not necessarily be designated a nation state actor because of the way they have these loose affiliations, but nonetheless, they're relatively well protected, if you will. And so it's very hard for law enforcement to get to them. And they're very gifted, if you will, not sophisticated digitally to mask themselves. And so it's hard to find them and locate them. But the bottom line is they're organized syndicates, if you will, organized digital criminals, and they've got sophisticated business models. They have business development business models. They have investors, franchising. They sell certain malicious services for a fee. They have research and development teams that are evolving their digital exploits literally by the millisecond. They can marketing and communications. You've got a new ransomware exploit. They typically will, believe it or not, issue a press release about who they are, kind of as a threat that, by the way, here we are with the new guys in the block. If you fool with us, we're going to mesh with you big time. So if we issue a ransom, you better pay it, because you're going to, you'll see the difference if you don't. They also have customer service protocols. It sounds crazy, but my wife would call this Nordstrom-like service. If you pay the ransom, you'll actually get the decryption key, and they will tell you how they get on and how they get in, and literally how you can remediate your system so they don't come in a second time. But they also have accounts receivable and collections units. It's crazy. I've had clients who have been hit, thought, and they didn't communicate with the threat actor. They had good information systems. They recovered from what we call air-gapped backups, and were up and running 48 or 72 hours later. But 4 weeks later, the bad guys call, posing as maybe a journalist with a Russian accent, and they want to ask about that data breach you suffered 4 weeks ago, because you have a big role in maybe a certain business sector that the bad guys know about. And you have no idea who this is, because nobody outside your organization knew about that data breach that affected 10,000 consumers 4 weeks ago. Well, they said, well, we have all that consumer data. Would you like to see it? And if you'd like us to not post it on the web next week, you can pay us a 7-figure sum. And so that's their account receivable unit coming back to collect the ransom that they didn't get paid 4 weeks ago. And it's real. This is not automated. These guys are not, guys that sit in grandmother's basement drinking Mountain Dew and smoking dope. These are professional teams that actually go after the money that they believe left on the table, and they're collecting sometimes 7-figure sums of money. So they're very, again, unfortunately for us, sophisticated criminals. The major exploits we see they're purveying against businesses, and big and small. So merely because you're maybe in the SME market, you're nonetheless, if not a specific target, an opportunistic target for the bad guys. But they will go after you for a ransomware event where they will encrypt data. They will also steal data before they encrypt it. And then they will extort you whether to get a decryption key to decrypt it, or if you're concerned about posting that data because it's sensitive information, and they're trying to get you, to pay money either way to stop one or get the other. They also, when Russia invaded Ukraine, they didn't want to spend all the time doing reconnaissance of getting into a corporate system and then surveying the system, getting to feel how best where the sensitive information was to exfiltrate it and then encrypt it. Instead, they mastered the sophisticated phishing attack. So they will come into a user account. If they haven't already got credentials, they will spoof somebody, get into an account, and immediately shift over to SharePoint or some network data repository, steal that data. The user has no idea that's ever happened. It's a very swift, smash and grab by the bad guys in Eastern Europe. And then they will come back just a couple of days later with a very organized spreadsheet saying, oh, by the way, we just took this from your SharePoint. And if you pay us typically a low 6-figure, maybe high 5-figure ransom versus a 7-figure, we will go ahead and not post it. And in fact, we'll show you proof of deletion. And what we found is that we saw thousands of those attacks were probably trying to fund the war effort, Russia versus Ukraine, versus the long-term encryption attack that may bring them more money ultimately, but for far fewer attacks because it took so much more energy, reconnaissance ability, et cetera, versus the smash and grab phishing attack. So we're still seeing a lot of that. And it's very dangerous, especially with your healthcare environment. You've got somebody who's got PHI in their account. You're still going to have the notification. You're still going to have the forensics expenses. But then you've also got the secondary access to funds attacks, where somebody, a human resources professional or a financial professional within an organization, is phished, and they're then used to manipulate invoices or other documents where a wire transfer or ACH transfer is going to go to a malicious account versus your account or say your vendor's account that you're going to pay. So those three primary attacks, an extortion attack, an exfiltration attack, or that attack to get secondary access to funds, are happening every single day. And our team is seeing 45 plus of those attacks a week, resulting in millions of dollars of damage a week.
So, Sean, that's a great point, which takes me to where I want to go next. But again, it was mentioned earlier, these are just no longer, go to the bank and rob the money, or, cops and robbers or otherwise. I mean, this has now become, if you will, for lack of better description, I mean, this is organized crime at maybe even a higher level, or certainly on the level that it was in the early years, 70s and 80s and things of that nature with RICO. But you mentioned costs and things of that nature. What are the costs that you're seeing, whether it's first party, third party, regulatory, and while you're there, let's transition also to who is being targeted. I hear law firms because of the data they have, clearly hospitals, but businesses in general, government. I mean, there's really, I suppose, no limit to the targets, but costs and who are they going after?
So well, again, there's really no limit. We see it across all sectors. We serve as outside counsel to businesses in every business sector, but healthcare entities are hit hard. They're treasure trove of information. It's not just personal information, but it's healthcare information, some proprietary information, et cetera. And because of the potential regulatory penalties as well, bad guys think that perhaps a higher ransom might be due to prevent posting or something else along those lines. The tech industry is big in large part because they've got proprietary information they're concerned about, but there is a perception that maybe they've got certain financials that will leverage them for a higher ransom payment. In the manufacturing sector, you've got operations systems, not so much consumer information, but operation systems that are obviously the core part of the business model. Those are taken offline, revenue shut down, it leverages a ransom payment.
Let me jump in real quick. You mentioned manufacturing as well. So it's I mean, aside from the money aspect, which I think would concern us as individuals and even businesses, we lose money, we have an issue. But what about also the trademarks or the processing secrets that we have? Again, I manufacture whatever it is. How do I manufacture it better? I mean, is that not also what China or Russia or these actors, again, whether they're designated states or not? Because then I take it the cyber criminals will go to the dark web and can sell this, what would be, again, proprietary or copyrighted information. Is that accurate or?
Exactly, precisely. You guys are spot on. So we do some work in the defense industry, and so that's where we will see what we call an advanced persistent threat or APT actor. I have to be careful here with what I can share, and I'm not sure, but typically it is a big actor out of Southeast Asia. And they're going after proprietary information. They're known for that. They're very, very good at that, unfortunately. They're the best in the world at stealing that proprietary information. And oftentimes, because they're dealing with rather sophisticated entities in the, say, aerospace industry, they are let's just say they're well steeped in coming into networks, trying to infiltrate a network perimeter without triggering alerts. Whereas the actors in Eastern Europe, primarily Russia, perhaps even Ukrainian before the war effort, they're the best in the world at monetizing data. And so they've got specific tools. We see them coming into networks, identifying the sensitive data that they will exfiltrate, and then use their various tools, whether the criminal exploits, the extortionate tools, or the dumping on the dark web to monetize the data. And then we do have actors out of West Africa who really specialize on hacks in the accounting systems. And when I see an accounting firm hack, I know it's probably somebody coming from Nigeria, quite frankly. They're experts in the tax applications. And so to that extent, hacking to some extent is cultural. We know if it's Southeast Asia, typically proprietary. If it's Eastern Europe or West Africa, we typically see the monetization of data. It's just a question of where that data comes from.
Okay. So I'd like to bring
Chris, imagine for a moment if somebody was able to get their hands on the original formula of Coca-Cola.
Right. Yes.
What would Coke pay to make sure that didn't get into the wrong hands? And now take that and think of that like an auto theft ring. That car is more valuable by its parts. So every single threat actor looks at they don't look at one part of it. They don't just look at the tires and wheels. They're looking at what are the value to the individual parts. So the level of sophistication and the financing behind this level of sophistication is at a level that's much higher than I think folks really understand and realize.
Right. Agreed.
You know, it's formidable.
There's no doubt about it. And again, I use the terms organized crime, but it's really the funding that they're getting, and then why they're doing this, which is to then go fund other, geopolitical, wars, if you will, or just battles and things of that nature. Power, which countries, strive for. But let's go, because we're just about halfway, or we are at halfway point. Let's jump into what is a data breach? What's the anatomy of a data breach? When would the agent get notification? And then more importantly, where do we as the agents really show our value with the client and explaining to them, here's what's going to happen next. Here's what will happen after that. The teams such as, Sean, that get notified, they get brought in, etc. Keith, can you expand upon that for us?
It could start with a phone call at 2 o'clock in the morning, right? Because somebody received a note that they no longer have access, or Monday they walk in and it's the blue screen of death, or, where they have a third-party supplier who they haven't been able to get, deliveries or shipments from for 3 or 4 days, and they're starting to wonder and scratch their head. They're going, hey, what's going on? I'm not getting straight answers. They said their systems were down for a few hours. So it doesn't always have to be you physically that you believe has been impacted. It could also be your third parties, which brings up the other conversation around contingent business interruption. But then the fact is, now what do you do? And the most important thing, and Sean said this, you don't spend a whole lot of time thinking about whether or not you need to begin this process. You dial that number, you send that email, and you need to start that process as soon as possible. And then actually, normally I would speak about this, but Sean's so much better at it. This is when Sean's firm gets the note, right? To start to get going. You want to talk about what happens next, Sean, in the connection?
Yeah, so what I was going to say, Sean, can you touch upon, you did a little bit earlier, but, notification from clients, notification to the government, whether it's industry notifications, regulatory, what can we help our guide our clients from an agency perspective on what they may expect?
So I won't go into, I can go down some rabbit holes here, but the key thing is preparation. And what you do in the process of discussing with your clients what they need, explaining to them what it is and how it ultimately operates is critical. That agent, if you will, the broker education is absolutely critical for them to understand what the value is and what they're getting, and then how to operationalize it. But right off the top, they should all have an instant response plan, and that's part of it. And in that, knowing who the broker is, right, that number for the broker to file the claim, as well as their internal and external responders. And so assuming something like that occurs where they call you and you're able to file a claim on their behalf, it could be 2:30 in the morning. What we will typically do is we'll get a call. We have hotlines, we staff hotlines with partners 24/7, 365, right? Assuming we get a call from a client at 2:30 in the morning on a Saturday, what we're going to do is immediately hop on the line, assess what may have occurred, and assuming we think it's it appears to be a ransomware matter because we have certain documents that are encrypted, what we will immediately do is simultaneously call either the forensics firm they've identified and we put under contract under privilege via their instant response plan, or we'll identify who their carriers and make sure their forensics firm is a preferred provider of that carrier. So they're ultimately going to be approved when they provide us a statement of work. But we're going to bring them into another call to scope out the potential forensics investigation that's required to get that company operational. Simultaneously, at 2:30 in the morning, I'm texting a claims counsel for that carrier to make sure they know they've got a claim either that has been filed or is pending filing. And so they can be available on standby to review that statement of work and approve it. Like I may have mentioned before, we want to make sure that every penny that's ultimately spent is pre-approved by the carrier, so the claims process is seamless. And that's part of having all these pieces in place by the time you get there. So at 2:30 in the morning, we're rolling to figure out what happened, immediately bringing in a forensics firm, perhaps if they're necessary. And then within 45 minutes or so of that call, typically receiving their statement of work, identifying what it's going to take to remediate, get them operational, and their hours and the estimated costs. We immediately will summarize that, get that out to the claims counsel we've just texted at 2:35. And so they review that and hopefully will approve it because it's a forensics firm that has worked with that carrier for some time, which is why they're previously approved by them as a preferred provider. Get that statement of work approved, then we immediately get the documents executed. And within 2 hours or so of that call, you've got a forensics firm that is starting to help contain the incident by deploying certain digital agents that are called endpoint detection and response tools, that sort of thing. But that's how the process typically gets started. So you want to make sure you've got, again, I have a dog in this race, so I have to be careful. I'm not selling anything, but whoever your chosen outside counsel is, it's best if you have somebody who's familiar with data privacy and information security and has that sense of urgency to run with this, because in a ransomware attack, an hour or two that are down can equate to a day or two of revenue. And so you want to make sure you're responding immediately. And sometimes if you're in there immediately to contain it, you can actually minimize the deployment of that agent or the malicious agent if it's already in there. So you can reduce the scope and scale of that attack as well, which means you reduce the scope and scale of the impact, the revenue loss, and the expense of the insurance claim. But after you get the resources approved, resources in there, then it's a matter of that cadence call, the first, in the morning, perhaps the evening, every day, to make sure that everything that needs to be done to remediate, to get you operational, is being done. And you've identified your internal stakeholders, your external responders. Everybody's working in unison through coordination, perhaps with outside counsel as a project manager. And during that process, once you identify what's been impacted, we're always got our eyes on, is there consumer information there, right? Are there regulatory implications here? And identifying what the notification obligations are. Even before we may know whether consumer information is affected, merely based on your business sector, you may have to provide that regulatory notification, which we would do within, could be 72 hours perhaps. Maybe if you're a publicly held company, you're going to have to worry about that 4-day time frame. DoD, it could be 24 hours. But there's going to be immediate, perhaps, regulatory notification in some sectors. But it's a consumer notification that typically is going to be within 30 days or so based on the statute. But that's going to be our expectation. It's going to be hopefully within that time frame. And then we're going to identify the data sets that have been affected at some point. It's not going to be immediate. And then identify the residential location of the consumers, because the laws are driven by the residential location of the consumer, regardless of where the business is located, which means that you may have, out of one incident, you may have 17 states affected. Their laws will come into play because you've got consumers in 17 states, even though your business may be located in one. And we're going to assess that. And at some point, if you've got hundreds or thousands of letters that have to go out, then you'll engage a third-party notification provider, identify the remediation services, credit monitoring, identity theft protection, perhaps identity theft insurance, so there's no out-of-pocket costs. And part of that, even if it's not required by statute, we might recommend, because that's also going to reduce your liability. If in fact you reduce the pecuniary or financial harm that might befall a victim, you're going to reduce the liability that could flow, but perhaps could otherwise create standing in a class action lawsuit. And so we're going to keep our eyes on that. Yes, go ahead.
So would it be appropriate also, I mean, again, this is organized crime at this point. They're doing this to get their money or information. I mean, there's an end point for them to make sure they get it. So the attackers, if you will, for lack of a better word, I mean, they're expecting this call usually from a cyber team. They're awaiting, you're going to call us. We're awaiting it. We're going to work this out. Is that fair to say from the attacker's position? If you have coverage or not, assuming you have coverage, we're going to get contacted and we're going to work this out so that I can give you this information. I mean, that's why they're doing this, correct?
So typically, if it's assuming it's a ransomware attack, you'll have a ransomware note that says, "Oh, by the way, call us or contact us," and they'll have a certain address. Typically, it's an email address and it's some location. And so you do. And if you don't communicate with them, and this is part of the strategy here, If you don't communicate with them, oftentimes they're going to start to leak the information they've stolen, and that's going to have an impact. So what we want to do, even if we don't intend to pay ransom, is by default, we don't want to pay ransom if we can possibly avoid it. But we're typically going to recommend that we engage what we call a threat actor communicator to come in and start that communication to make sure the bad guys don't do anything stupid like posting the information. And even if we're going to just pretend to negotiate, we will do that as long as we need to make sure our windows are closed, our doors are locked, and the vulnerabilities are secured, so that if we choose not to pay ransom, then at least we're prepared to notify customers or consumers that may have been affected if their data is going to be leaked. And
so that leads me to Keith's point earlier. Just I want to touch upon it because of the significant impact it could have on the business interruption or the contingency business interruption. Keith, do you mind taking a minute or two at most just to touch upon it and what the effect could be to a business owner?
Yep, as you could tell, and so for those folks who know me on this call know I could talk about this topic all day long. Now you understand why Sean and I get along so well. So because we could do this all day and actually do, right? So
brothers from another mother.
Yeah, hey man,
you two are doing great. You're doing great. Thank you.
Sometimes we wear the same sport jacket too. So here's the thing. If this sounds to folks like a kidnapping, it's because it is. There are lots of components to this, and the industry products have really matured since the dot-com boom forward to handle things like bricking, recognizing that, oh, wait, now I've got to replace all this equipment. Is it worth paying 5 times the value of a machine to have somebody do forensics and have somebody down for 5 days until I can validate whether that machine was or was not infected? No, let's just put another machine on that desk. Let's get 2 or 3 machines in the accounting department on a different network as soon as possible so we can at least have interaction with the client so they don't start calling the local press on us. There's a lot of that goes on in the process, and that all starts with that initial contact to the carrier, right? And then the carriers often are going to contract with somebody like Sean or others, and they're going to have their preferred providers. So you're going to find yourself having a wealth of information available at your fingertips, and for one reason only, because your insurance agent made sure that you bought cyber. That's it. And with that comes a wealth of information, right? And then you get the folks like Sean and others on your side at a point in time when you might feel the most violated that you have felt in your entire life. I've had folks go through fires and floods and car accidents, and they're emotional. And within a few hours, they're okay. Look, because I touched them, they go, I'm alive, I'm good, right? Mm-hmm. But these types of claims don't go away in a couple hours. And it is a constant reminder, and folks do head shaking and understanding that you have folks on your side through this process is huge to the business as well as your personal feelings about it. Now, the business interruption starts to rattle around in folks' heads because all of a sudden they're not running their business for days. Employees are twiddling their thumbs. And that could be direct as a result of their direct loss themselves, or it could be, as I pointed out earlier, the result of a third party or an important supplier being impacted that now is impacting their business. So they've had nothing go on. And, most of these programs, just like property programs, have a waiting period, and then it all comes down to a lot to your records. I get this question on the application a lot. So are these auditable? And here's the answer. Who cares? Here's the challenge. If you have a loss and you said that you do $2 million a year in revenue, and you really do $20 million a year in revenue, that is not the time during your business interruption process to explain that, oops, I forgot a zero, right? You want to be as forthcoming as possible on these applications because the carrier is going to stand behind you and give you all of those resources. You need to be as honest and frank as possible during the application process. So the business interruption side of this, I've had claims that ended up with no ransomware. The client had great, as Sean already pointed out, great infrastructure. They caught it really fast. It was a very automated process. The threat actor wasn't as dangerous, et cetera. But we still had $2 million in business interruption. Okay, and never wrote a check for ransomware. So do not underestimate the value of the business interruption portion of the policies, the bricking coverage, and the contingent business interruption.
So this reminds me of what we learned, I guess, a few years ago or many years ago. I mean, this is disaster planning, but not from, like you mentioned earlier, a property perspective or liability perspective. But again, it's a cyber planning. It's a cyber planning event. In the case of a shutdown or otherwise an attack, this is who is on my team. This is what I have to do, how I have to do it, when I have to do it. So again, proper planning prevents bad performance. What do we do?
I don't even think of it as cyber. I just think of it as good business planning. A disaster recovery plan, as Sean pointed out before, is like an incident response plan. What happens if? And when you're a little kid and you go to a park somewhere and people say, if we get split up, let's all meet at this location, right? I'm sorry, that was before cell phones. I'm dating myself. Now you might say, let's call each other. But that was effectively the basics behind some form of disaster recovery plan. We all need that disaster recovery plan. You go to school, it says, let's all meet by the flagpole if everybody has to come out. That's all planning. Every business, large or small, should have some form of incident response or disaster recovery planning. Cyber is just a portion of that, because you would have it for fire as well.
So while you're
Chris, Chris, I was just going to mention that with regard to that, we have some, for instance, we do some work in the energy sector, and say electrical utilities, if you think for years, they've had a disaster recovery plan, or emergency operations plan. They get hit with an ice storm, things go out. They've got to figure out how to get power back to customers as soon as possible, and they've got a plan to do that. And recently, as we start to take those plans and transition them to a data cyber incident, cyber related incident, that's like every business should do as well. What happens if my operation systems are hit? How do I get recovered? So when we get called, ultimately you're going to have the different project or data flows. You're going to have the project flows. You're going to have maybe the forensics firm that's starting to contain. Maybe you've got a threat actor communicator. You've got a separate workflow. Maybe you've got internal communications. You can have that notice to your employees to let them know that, yes, we understand something's taking place. We're investigating it. We're trying to get operational as quickly as possible. And then you've got that your client communication flow as well, making sure that your marketing professionals, so you're doing the same thing with them, let them know that we understand we're not as responsive as we want to be, but we're working on it. We're investigating. We'll be back in touch quickly. And you're also looking at that fifth one, the regulatory. What do we have to assess there? But you've got all those things going simultaneously, if you will, in parallel, because of the resources you've got through your carrier.
So let's talk about real quickly, we only have a few minutes left, but again, we spoke about planning and what to do ahead of time. What are the best practices to avoid a claim? I know, both of you can answer this, so I'll allow you to decide who, but between multi-factor authentication, I mentioned earlier, encryption was mentioned, backup, how do we, again, create that plan? What should we be doing now? And take us through those steps, if you don't mind, in the next about 5 minutes here.
I'll do the checkbox items for you real quick. Obviously, multi-factor authentication, not just in your business life, but also your personal life. It is just as important for you to protect yourself personally as business.
Good point.
It's embarrassing to say, but there are folks who have phenomenal infrastructure for their corporate email with encryption, multi-factor authentication, and then they've got some free email system that basically all their bank accounts are linked to. And do not underestimate the intelligence of a threat actor to know that. Endpoint protection, don't just think in terms of antivirus, it's endpoint protection. So when you see that term endpoint on the applications, what they're speaking about is any device that you might have at your fingertips or access to. How are you protecting that? And you should be looking at the best solutions that you possibly can. And I'm not going to mention brands. I know people want us to. The data backup is very, very important. Even so far to say that when folks move from hosting their own Exchange servers and then decommissioning those and then going to the cloud-based systems, now you find folks who are backing up their cloud-based systems to offline systems so that they can have a redundancy of that. Don't just assume because it's in the cloud, it's backed up, folks. Bad assumption to make, right? So also understand that restoration of cloud to that might take longer. So factor that into your recovery plan and your potential business interruption plan. Those are probably the biggies, but one of the last ones, which is huge, Sean pointed it out, encryption. So encryption of those devices and a backup is also important. So if someone does get a hold of it, they're really not reading the data. And they also know, like a thief knows, that there's not as much value to this. They know there's not as much value to this. So when they can read an email that says you're coming out with a brand new product in 2 weeks and they can leverage that against you, they will.
Great. So, Sean, if you don't mind, because I do want to come back to Keith on one more question in a moment here. In terms of the encryption, though, is it the client, meaning the business owner, is able to work with their IT vendor in terms of encryption? Just guide us through, where does that come from, or how does the business owner go about looking?
Yeah, I mean, you know what your critical infrastructure is, right? So think of places where you have data, et cetera. Each one of those vendors you're going to work with to make sure that encryption box is checked. Then you have physical hardware devices that you might be using. You want to make sure those physical devices also, you're checking the box on encryption. There's a lot of folks who don't realize that I'm trying not to use brands, that the operating systems that they use today often have an option to turn encryption on, but it may or may not have come that way out of the box.
Gotcha. Sean, do you want to add
really polite about this? So we're related to the brand. So if you do use an MSP, you know, if you have a managed service provider, or if you have an internal IT infrastructure, that's great. But a lot of small businesses do not have access to either. So they really need to make a proactive effort to connect with that. I'll even say that some of the carriers now, particularly on the small business space, have provided resources to those small businesses and access to those resources to assist them with helping to protect. And some of those programs provide for active or proactive monitoring of those small businesses during the policy periods. We didn't even talk about that, but the influx now of active insurance is having a major impact on both the frequency and the severity of these losses. So there's plenty of resources available to a business owner should they have an interest.
Yes.
And again, that would be through the policy itself that is sold, and the firms that would come along. You know, again, if there was an incident, they're already there behind them, which can also help guide them both in the beginning, but certainly, you know, on the end point. So, Sean, is there anything else you would like to add? I don't see any questions yet, but I want to offer that real quickly. We're just getting near that hour of wrapping up.
I second or anchor everything that Keith just said. You know, key is having an instant response plan in place. Make sure you've got layered security and those other critical security controls. The MFA are actually critical, and the endpoint detection and response tool, the EDR tool to every endpoint that's linked to the internet. It's critical now in the ransomware environments. It's the only way you're going to be able to identify ransomware attack when it actually, they get beyond your perimeter, and they will, and they start to execute a ransomware attack. It's that EDR tool that will stop that in its tracks and allow you to save your network. And so those things it's really important to get rid of the thought, well, I'll do that next quarter. Now think about doing it today, because that's critical to protect your business model.
So with that said, I know the question was asked, though, how do we get comfortable selling the policy? Obviously familiarizing ourselves with the terms that, you know, were mentioned here today, you know, MFA, endpoint, etc. But aside from talking to our underwriters, any recommendations, gentlemen, with respects to the agent's side of it, to just get comfortable if they're not, and how do we do it? And then if, again, I don't see any questions, but I just want to at least give a minute or two for questions. So can we just get a quick response?
I'm going to throw in that a session like this today that focuses on what happens after you sell the policy is just as important to knowing or empowering you on how to sell the policy. Being able to have the examples that were pointed out today, particularly by Sean, and understanding all the areas that a client needs to insure against is part of the conversation. We need to solve our clients' problems. If the client then embraces this process, understanding how to prepare the application is a matter of doing it over and over again. You know, they say if you do something 21 times, it becomes a habit. So here's what I would suggest. You're not going to get good at something until you do it frequently enough. That's just the bottom line. You don't think about this just as something that you're going to do on a renewal basis. You think about doing it now, today, and then also doing it on renewal, so that a client may see two indications by the time they even get their renewal.
Okay.
Don't wait until there's a problem to speak about the coverage. It's probably
Chris, also, we do a lot of incident response planning. And from an information security perspective, and I've been involved in information security now for 25 plus years, being placed with a good cyber product is critical to that incident response process. We make sure that our clients, every single one, is placed with a good cyber carrier to make sure they're covered, because you can only protect so much technologically. That residual economic risk that can be mitigated through cyber insurance. But every business needs cyber insurance.
100%.
Understood. And I would completely agree. So With that, I want to thank both Keith and Sean for their time, for their expertise. Thank all of you for joining us this morning, again, for your time and spending it with us. We certainly hope and pray that you have gotten valuable information from this session. I know we have maybe a minute or two left, so I will open it up. If anyone does have any questions they want to add to the chat box or provide any thoughts, please do so. We'll give a minute or two here. If Keith or Sean have anything they want to add in a closing remark, feel free, and we'll see if any questions pop up. Otherwise, we will close this out here in another minute or two.
I'm just going to throw out that we see a lot of liability that emanate from contractual liability. And so oftentimes businesses, regardless of how big or small you are, don't think about those contracts you have with clients, where oftentimes they'll have a notification provision in the contract that you hadn't thought about because you never thought it would happen to you, but you've got to notify them almost immediately if they have some sort of a data security incident, regardless of who's impacted. And it all depends on how that contract is formed. It also typically will have 12 or 13 data privacy or information security provisions, and you may find yourself in breach without even knowing about it because you really haven't paid attention to that. So we find that, again, more liability emanates from contracts than the regulations and the statutes. And I would really encourage you to look at those things, get a feel for whether you have a system or if you need some assistance putting one together.
Okay.
Yep.
Keith?
No, I'm just thinking, she brought up contracts. So Sean, we'll do another meeting just on the impact of class action lawsuits in the cyber. How about
And by the
that?
way, we're managing over 40 of them this week. So
Right.
And,
Yeah.
you know, and I'll just end on this, you know, 40, 45 just from your firm may not necessarily seem a lot to those that are on this, webinar this morning, but imagine that times all the firms like you, Sean, that do this all across the United States. And then the numbers just become, you know, that much more exponentially higher and higher. And we know that the threats are going up every single day. And, you know, we had Y2K over, 20 some years ago. And, I think all of that is just, it's here, it's happening, it's going to be more prevalent. And of all the other coverages that we do sell as agents, this certainly has to be within the top three, if not maybe the top one these days, just because it's the next criminal activity. So with that said, Brad has informed me there were no questions asked, a few positive comments with regards to the information. So again, I know we had two very experienced, very informed, and very good presenters. And I just thank both Keith Savino and Sean Hoar for their time today. And I thank all of you as well. And this will conclude our session on the deep dive with cyber threats and the anatomy of a cyber claim. Thank you, everyone, on behalf of the PIANJ.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.